Reading through chapter 4 of Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell, I noticed all the male nouns and pronouns that are being used. So it might lead you to wonder, are there any women in heaven? So let's dive into chapter 4. Before we get onto that issue, I want to just point out Swedenborg's use of one particular term, and that's charity. He uses it in a very particular sense in his writing, so it's worth spending some time on it here. He gives a couple of useful definitions in his book Introducing the New Jerusalem, otherwise entitled The New Jerusalem and Its Heavenly Doctrine. He writes, "Charity is acting prudently and with the intention that good may come of it." He qualifies that in his next sentence. If anyone gives help to a poor or needy wrongdoer, he does harm to the neighbour through him. Charity is doing what is right in every task, and one's duty in every office one holds. Anyone, therefore, who does any kind of good for good's sake, and acts honestly and justly for the sake of honesty and justice, loves the neighbour and exercises charity. And charity is an internal affection causing a person to wish to do good, and this without recompense. It is his pleasure in life to do this. So charity is an attitude and an approach to life that includes, but is not limited to, giving to the poor. So back to that question about women. Working from Doris Harley's 1958 translation of Heaven and Hell, you can see a number of references to man, his will and his understanding. And this comes about because of two things. Firstly, the Latin word homo or hominy, like the English word man, is ambiguous when it comes to gender. It's used both as a gender-neutral term and as a masculine one. Secondly, for many years we habitually translated most things with little thought, simply translating hominy or homo as man and leaving the reader to interpret them according to their own biases. In recent years we've tried to be a little more specific, but it does show one of the problems with translations in general. I'm not a fan of the word volition, for example, used here in George Dole's 2000 translation. I like Doris Harley's will much better. I find it much more common and more clearly understood. Now, if you're interested in discovering more, I can only recommend you read Swedenborg's book Conjugal Love, or Love in Marriage. Yes, he tells us there are in fact women in heaven. Indeed, men and women retain their gender after death. So Swedenborg's heaven is not androgynous as many theories of heaven today are. Indeed, there are marriages in heaven. And Swedenborg shows how women's perspective of reality is superior to that of men in many ways. And it's curious that Swedenborg's audience was, generally speaking, an 18th century, educated, intellectual and male group, and he spends much of his time trying to unveil the female mind to his readers. I'll send a particular shout out to a friend of mine, Ros Taylor, who's been involved for some years in a project to reimagine Emanuel Swedenborg's Conjugal Love from a feminine perspective. In previous editions, we've considered Swedenborg's influences on later creative writers and thinkers, and I thought today was a good opportunity to honour the women. You'll be familiar with names such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Helen Keller, who for many years championed both women's rights and disabled rights. But there are many Swedenborgian scholars who are women and have played quite significant roles in the Swedenborgian movement. I'll mention Doris Harley, who is the translator of the edition of Heaven and Hell from 1958 that we're using for this series, and many other of Swedenborg's works. I know Gwen Dresser Mack, particularly for her book on prayer called Talking with God. And then there's Dorothea Harvey, who wrote a book called The Holy Center, dealing with the Israelites' religious practices. And Anita Dole, I know for her Bible study notes, which stretches to 6 volumes. In conclusion, I wonder whether you noticed the intermediate angels that Swedenborg mentions in paragraph 27. Why is it you think that communication between the sides of heaven can only take place through these intermediates? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, feel free to read ahead and ask any questions that you might have, popping them in the comments, or else just read along with us. Enjoy the journey.